Okay, here is the next video lecture for sensation and perception. The last slide you saw was this one, and we're talking about the incorrect perceptions, these illusions, if you will. Now we're going to move into an area that is mentioned in your textbook, and we're going to talk about it a little bit here. It's called subliminal persuasion. Now, in psychology, we're kind of split about, whether we really feel that this exists or not. Well, let's talk about what subliminal means first. Subliminal, by definition, is something that exists below the normal limit of perception. Sub means below. Like think of a submarine. It goes under or below the water. Liminal means limit, so it's below the normal limit of perception. Is it possible to perceive things that exist underneath or below our threshold for detection? Does it really exist? There is some research on this. Advertisers have used subliminal messages. Musicians have used subliminal messages to try to persuade people to buy products, to do certain things, without them realizing what they're even doing. All this kind of started in the 1950s. There was a movie theater proprietor who flashed during one of his movies. If you've ever gone to the movies and you see the previews, he flashed a message that was in front of the eyes of the consumers for 3/1000ths of a second. And he posted this message once every 5 seconds. So it was only up for 3/1000ths of a second. That's not nearly long enough for you to be able to look at something, read it, process it, and understand it. But he suggested that in 1957, when he did this, over a 6-week period, the sales of his popcorn rose 57%, and that the sales of Coca-Cola rose almost 20%. So he is making the argument, or made the argument in the 50s, that subliminal perception did work. People didn't know that they were reading this message that said, eat popcorn and drink Coca-Cola, but somehow subliminally they were being persuaded to do so. Now, can you prove that this really happened or happens? Can we prove that subliminal persuasion really exists? We could look at these statistics and you can see that before he started doing this, popcorn and Coke sales were down, and then after he did it during the 6-week period, they were up. Could it be something else? Maybe there is an extra variable he wasn't accounting for. Or maybe it was in the summertime, where people naturally want to drink more, and when you drink more, you want to eat more. So maybe that's something he didn't account for. Who knows? But musicians like Kiss, Styx, the Beatles even, have used subliminal messages in their music. Retail stores have inserted subliminal messages in their music, the really awful elevator music that you listen to when you're changing clothes or you're trying on clothes. Will insert messages like, don't shoplift, or buy a bunch of stuff. I'm not supposed to do this, but it has been done in the past, and research seems to suggest that sometimes this stuff works. It can curtail shoplifting and can increase sales. Now, extrasensory perception is something a little different. While psychologists can't really agree on the extent to which subliminal messages really are impactful, we do agree in psychology that ESP, or extrasensory perception, is something that lies outside of the scope of science. This is not anything that we can really prove. Now, it's up to you to decide whether or not you think psychics really have ability and can predict the future. Totally up to you to decide that. This is stuff that lies outside the realm and scope of science. But we can talk about briefly 4 different classifications of ESP. Telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and telekinesis. And I'll start with the first one, which is telepathy. Telepathy is the ability to communicate with people simply through thoughts. So if we were telepathically communicating, I would, without saying a word or moving my body, would just think something. And then you would receive that thought, and then you would think something like a response back to me. And I would be able to decipher and interpret that. So we're communicating not with words or body language, but through thoughts. Now, can this really happen? Most people would say probably no. There are some people who believe in telepathic ability. It's not something we can measure. It's not something that psychology endeavors to explain, because it is not science. It's not. This isn't stuff we can measure reproduce, and prove through replication. Now, clairvoyance. This is the next classification of ESP. And you'll want to jot this down too. Clairvoyance, by definition, and I'm going to give you a sort of a strange explanation or definition, but then I'll explain what it means. With clairvoyance, you have a receiver of information, but no sender of information. Again, you have a receiver of information, but no sender of information. And the example that I can think of that might make this simple for you, card trick. Let's say I have a deck of cards. I put them all face down on a table. All 52 cards face down. And what I do is have you pick one. I cannot see what the card is because they're face down and they've been shuffled. So if I am clairvoyant, then whatever card you choose, I would be able to tell you exactly the card that you picked without looking at it. No one has sent me the information, but I have received it somehow. So what I might do is put my hand on your card and say, well, I think this is the Ace of Spades. And sure enough, I turn it over, it's the Ace of Spades. Or maybe you pick another card that's face down, and I put my hand on it without looking at it, and I somehow figure out that it is the Three of Hearts. And it is. I turn it over, and sure enough, it's the Three of Hearts. That's clairvoyance. Again, not scientific. Precognition. This is very simply the ability to forecast the future, or to tell the future. A lot of psychics purport to have precognitive abilities. They purport to be able to predict what will happen to you. They look at your hand, they read your palm, or they ask some questions, and they forecast who you will marry, or when you will die, or or what's going to happen to you 10 years from now. Now, can they really do this? Again, this isn't scientific. We can't measure this. This is outside of science. And last but not least, telekinesis. This is the ability to move things or objects just with your mind, not with your hands or not with equipment, but with your mind. So if I had telekinetic abilities, this pencil right here, I'm laying it down. I'm going to use my mind without my hand to move this pencil. So now I'm thinking about moving the pencil in. Oh my God, it's moving. Holy cow. How did I do it? Well, I'm tricking. I'm really using my hand, you can see. But that would be an example of telekinesis. Levitation, being able to move objects, people, just with your mind and not with your hands. The thing about ESP is that a lot of times, just like anything in life, we assume very complicated explanations for things, when often a simpler explanation will do just fine. Occam's razor. A razor is a rule of thumb or just a general guideline. So Occam's razor, do not assume a complicated explanation for something when a simpler one will do just fine. I'll give you an example of this. I could come home, put my keys down on top of the table in my living room, which I do a lot, and I walk outside for 5-10 minutes. I come back, my keys are gone. Now, I can assume a very complicated explanation for this. I could assume, I'm going to go back for a second. I could assume that somehow telekinetically my neighbor used his mind to move my keys from the table in the living room to an undisclosed location. That's a pretty complicated explanation. Or I could come up with a simpler explanation. I have 6 cats and 2 dogs. Probably what has happened is one of the cats or the dog has gotten up on the table and knocked the keys down behind the table. That's a simpler and more feasible explanation. So don't assume a complicated explanation when a simpler one will suffice. There are a lot of criticisms of extrasensory perception research. The first one is failure. You want to jot these down too. Failure to replicate or to reproduce. Researchers discover that specific results of ESP studies or experiments can't be repeated or replicated. In science, if we want to say that we have discovered something, we have to do experiments and we have to find similar results. We have to get what's called reliability, if you remember from the document that I sent you. We have to replicate the experiment and get similar results. We can't really do this with ESP research, so it's not science. Lack of brain mechanism. We don't really know how specifically the brain could produce or pick up ESP signals. There's nothing there to explain this at the level of the brain. Lack of signals. There are no ESP signals that have ever been measured, and it's not known what form these signals may take. And then alternative explanations. While some ESP studies are well documented, other very plausible explanations are often available, like with my keys on the table, for example. Somebody didn't move them telekinetically. My dog probably got up there and knocked them behind the table. So that gets us back to Occam's razor. And that's the end of of the Sensation and Perception video lecture series. Thank you.